me in Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. Anybody really like watching movies? Anybody, you like watching the movies or TV shows or whatever? You know, you get the bowl of ice cream, you watch Netflix for like 6 hours at a time. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah, don't judge. All right, because you know. Right? But you ever have that moment where a dude comes on the screen or a girl or whatever is coming on the screen and you're like, oh, it's that guy. You know? And you don't know who that guy is, but you know it's that guy. You know what I mean? You know you've seen him somewhere before. And so you're going, okay, who is that actor? Who is that? Now you're not even paying attention to the movie anymore because you're trying to figure this guy out. So what do we always do when we have a question? We grab the phone and go to Google. You know, and you look the dude up, and then you're like, oh, he was the guy that was in that show. And now you can't unsee it. You know, or worse, you Google him, and then you're like, whoa, I haven't seen any of this stuff that the guy's in. You know, so then you're like, why does he look familiar? Maybe I've seen this rich, famous person at Walmart. I don't know. You know, but why why is he so familiar? You ever had that happen to you? And that's all fun and games when it's on TV, right? Because those people aren't real anyway, right? They're just TV people. They create them digitally and electronically, and Disney owns the rights. Okay, but here's what happens in real life. We can get so familiar with God that we treat him like that guy. We recognize him. I mean, we're like, oh, yeah, we come to church to worship God. We know the songs. We know the moves. You know, we know all the stuff. I can say, go to Acts chapter 17. Everybody's like, I know where Acts chapter 17 is. Some of you probably already know the text I'm going to use. Well, you should because it's written on the board, right? But we go through the motions without truly recognizing God. We know this is familiar. We know this exists somewhere. We know this is somehow connected to, now it's time to take a look at God again. It's time to launch in and see, okay, how do I know this God? Where do I know him from? Let's get back to this because the world we live in is messed up, guys. We cannot let God simply be a background character in our lives. The world is teaching us some things that are not godly. It puts a spin on God. And we've got to come to this understanding like we started last week. Everybody is a theologian. All of us are theologians. You thought theologians were just those seminary guys or the pastor if he's got doctor in front of his name. It's not. We all have a belief about God. The word theology simply means belief about God. You know, it's the study of God. What do you believe about him? And this is important because whatever you believe about God is going to affect every other aspect of your life. Even the atheists can't get away from this because they say, well, there is no God. That is a belief about God that will now influence the way they live their lives. You cannot get away from this. So we better make sure that we understand God the right way. And that's why we started this series last week called Doctrine, that we're going to rediscover what Christianity actually believes because there's been a lot of different theologies, a lot of different ideas, a lot of worldliness that's crept into the churches. And we've got to deal with this, guys. We've got to know our God. That's why last week we started, brief recap here, we started last week with the foundations of a biblical worldview. We said in order for us to truly understand the doctrine, the teachings of our faith, in order to truly lock down, we need to understand first that God is at work in our world. He has not jumped ship. He's not abandoned us. He is still at work in the world. Secondly, there are consequences to what we believe. We don't just get to believe whatever. We've got to believe truth, and there are consequences for not believing truth. We also have to understand that God requires faithful obedience of us, no matter the cost, because we do live in a world that has forgotten God. We've put him on a back burner. We don't want to acknowledge him anymore. We want to redefine him into our own image. It's been well said that God created us in his image, and we returned the favor. Yeah, we just took him and created him back in our image and we called it a day. And that is not good because even Christians, like we just talked about in our Mind War series, Christians today largely think like unbelievers. And it's because we've gotten away from the core of our doctrines and what we believe, because we have many Christians today who are functionally atheists. You say, what does that mean, functionally atheist? It's not my term, okay, it's out there. But what it means is Christians who basically live as if there is no God, as if God does not define everything, as if God is somehow removed and we just get to make it up as we go. Guys, we treat God like an app these days. We download God into our phone and we pull him out when we need him, and when it's convenient, hey, I've got my God app, and we kind of swipe it wherever, but we don't marvel at God anymore. We don't seek to understand God anymore. We don't pursue God anymore, collectively as a people. I mean, how many of you have your supermarket app that you use when you go to the store and you pull it out on a Tuesday when you're sitting down watching TV going, wow, my app. I need to understand this app. I need to grasp every aspect. I need to form study groups around my app. You know, you don't do that. Why? Because it's just an app. Don't treat God as though he is just an app. Guys, we've got to get back to the pursuit of our God and the understanding of our God. Why? Because you will never rise above your concept of God, because God will determine and define everything about you. Listen, the reality in our lives is you will worship something. That's the reality. We will worship something, and we call the worship of something other than God idolatry. Now, that's where we get to Acts chapter 17. Okay, I'm going somewhere with all this. Y'all hang on, all right? Because we're going to look at who God is this morning. And, I kind of wrestled with the title of this sermon a little bit. I was getting, the people that were here yesterday, I was getting, votes, and the vote was, evenly split, so that was no help. I wanted to call it Who or What is God. I also wanted to call it Who is God? And then I prayed, and I'm like, God, what do I call this thing? And he goes, are you asking a question, or are you telling people who I am? And I'm like, well, I want to tell them who you are. Then it's like, well, then let's call it Who God is. Because we're talking who God is, who he has revealed himself to be. This is vitally important that we understand it. Now, in Acts chapter 17, this is a pivotal text in the book of Acts. Paul is now taking the gospel to people who had no Jewish context. He goes up and he says, God, they're going to be like, what do you mean? There's like a billion gods. What one are you talking about? He was now no longer in Jerusalem, no longer in Israel, no longer in Judea. He is now in the nations. And he's gone to Athens. Athens was the seat of Greece. I mean, it was the Greek culture mecca. Okay, I mean, that's where this thing went down. These were the people who determined what was popular, what was cool, how people dressed, how people behaved, what people believed. This was this place. And as Paul gets into this area, he looks around, and in verse 22, he saw this tomb. He saw this tomb there and all these altars all around the city, and he was brokenhearted because the city was wholly given over to idolatry. Wholly given over to idolatry, right? And again, idolatry, before we dive into the text, let me just make sure we all understand what idolatry is. Idolatry is not just you got your little statue over the fireplace. Okay, it's not like you're going and bowing down to this little thing and going, whatever, to the little Buddha on the wall or whatever. Idolatry is anything, any person, any ideal, any ideology, and it's any noun that you give your life to pursue, that you make value out of, that you get your value from. That's what idolatry is. We can have in our culture, they were given wholly over to idolatry, so are we. We have idolatry of the spiritual. The spiritual. In our culture today, it is very good to be spiritual, right? I mean, everybody's spiritual as long as you don't try to define what spirit we're talking about, right? You can be, I believe in God. I just believe in the Spirit. I believe that all things function and flow together. I believe in the Force. I believe, we get into this stuff. We get into this heightened spirituality where there is no revealed truth. There is no dogmatic truth. It's all just whatever you want to make of it, right? That's where we kind of get to. That is idolatry of the spiritual. You see all the little coexist signs. You see all the things that say it doesn't matter as long as you're sincere. We found out last week you can be sincerely wrong, right? So we get into that type of an idolatry where we just worship a God of our own making. There's also idolatry of the stuff. Idolatry of the spirit and idolatry of the stuff. You know what idolatry of the stuff is? The new cell phone that you got to have or your life is over, right? The idolatry of possessions, property, the stuff. That stuff that you will never be happy if you don't have. and you need more than the other guy because you want to be happier than the other guy. And you know when you've got enough money? Never. You know when you got enough stuff? Never. Why? Because they're always making new stuff. I promise you, you go out and you give your life and your pursuit to get all the money you can so you can buy a car. Guess what's going to happen to that car? Gone. Or a new, better one's going to. You ever bought a car or something like that before and you're driving down the road and you see one you like better, like before you even get home? You're driving like, man, why didn't I see that one? Idolatry of the stuff is a rat race you will never win. There's also idolatry of the self. You know, we're given holy to idolatry too. We can't really knock Athens here. Idolatry of the self, me. Worship yourself and the world will follow. That's kind of the mantra of our culture. It's literally a commercial tag for some, like, I don't know, shaving lotion or something. I don't know. But anyways, it's like worship yourself, the world will follow. Just do you, you know? And in fact, you better accept everything about me or you're being unloving. And you better make it about me. In fact, all of you should make it about me because I'm all that, right? I'm all that in a bag of chips to bomb.com. That's me, baby. But it's the way our world operates. Here's a new one maybe for you. There's idolatry of the spin. What's idolatry of the spin? That's the spin we like to put on things. That's our knowledge, right? Back in verse 18 of this, we're not really going to get it, but there's two predominant groups of people here in Athens, the Epicureans and the Stoics. The Epicureans were very scientifically minded. They were very, let's get rid of emotion, let's get rid of the spiritual. The Epicureans sought to use all of their resources to try to dissuade people, get people out of worshiping any kind of God. They're not real anyway. Let's just throw that out. Don't let any God or spiritual influences come in. Everything you can believe can be felt and determined and proven that way. That's what the Epicureans believed. The Stoics were kind of the other side of the coin. They believed basically pantheism. Everything's God. The emotion is king. Logic is king. If I can justify it logically, then it must be justifiable, and you better accept it if I can prove it logically. If it feels good, do it. If it can be reasoned out, then it's okay. Nobody can judge you. And the Bible says these people, I love verse 18, the philosophers conversed with them. And you go on down in verse 21, it says, now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their whole time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. In other words, all these people ever wanted to do is bandwagon their ideology and promote it and argue with everybody else. Boy, we've come so far. Their YouTube channels were always at war. But that's not even where our idolatry stops. We also have, lastly, idolatry of the spectacle. We like to be entertained. And whatever entertains us, that's what we give everything we've got to. Why? Because these are the places where we're trying to find value. We want to be spiritual because there's a hole in our hearts that make us desire that. We want people to like us because we desire to be loved. We desire to be possessive of things that we take care of. It's almost like we were created to be stewards of stuff. So we want to have it. We want to have a knowledge that is deep, that we can grow deeper with other people and convince them of things. It's almost like we're called and created to evangelize. And you also have this point where we are created to seek something greater than ourselves. Wow, what is that? Now in this place called Athens, Greece, Paul looks around at all these things and he comes to this one altar that they wanted to cover all their bases. So they had the, you know how today we have the LGBTQ plus, you know, you got that little plus there just so they don't miss anybody. They had the all the gods plus. They didn't want to miss a god, just in case. So here's what Paul does. He finds that plus, and here's what he says to the people in verse 22. Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus, and he said, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're religious. For as I passed along, I observed the objects of your worship, and I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. That was their plus, the unknown God. And it says, the God you don't know about. He says, what therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. This I proclaim to you. He comes out and he says, okay, that God you don't know about, let me tell you about him. You know, it's interesting that Paul, in this moment where these people have no concept of God, they have nothing, they're wholly given to idolatry, where does Paul begin? he launches right into who God is. Launches right into making these people understand who is the real God, who is the true God. And the Bible refers to God as the true God over and over, implying there are false gods. And he wants us to understand who is the true God. So what do we do with that? Guys, it's vital we understand who God is so that we can avoid idolatry and not give ourselves to empty pursuits, but rather commit ourselves to our created purpose. And that is why we start with the doctrine of who God is. So this morning, we're going to look at this passage, this whole little interchange between them, and we're going to see three aspects of God's identity through this. Three aspects of God's identity that lead us out of idolatry and into life. To neglect and get away from what's going on over here in our empty pursuits to try to find something that fills us, we're going to get into God's realm. And we're going to see who God is, and how that shapes us. Fair enough? And this is going to be deep. I mean, you're going, whoa, Joey, and I'm going to warn you, some of this is going to be way beyond us, guys. Way beyond us. But if we're dealing with God, isn't that kind of what you'd expect? Because God is awesome. Joey's not. And, neither y'all, because God is great, and we want to know him. And the more we know him, the better we will see ourselves. And that's what we got a gun for here. I love what C.S. Lewis says. You know, he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and all those other things, right? But it says here, if you do not listen to theology, that will not mean that you have no ideas about God. Rather, it will mean that you have a lot of wrong ones. And we want to avoid that. So let's look at what God has revealed about himself through this text. All right, three aspects of God's identity. Number one, God is our creator. God is our creator, guys. You cannot get away from that. God made the heavens and the earth. Look where Paul starts here. Verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, yet he's actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Okay, hold up. God made us. That's where he starts. He doesn't try to argue their philosophies of it. He just says, look, God made us. Because here's the trick. You're not going to argue somebody to accept Jesus. That is a work of the Holy Spirit in and through them. Okay, if you can reason somebody into Christianity, somebody can come right behind you and reason somebody right out. This is a work of God. So Paul begins by stating, here's the work of God. First and foremost, he made you. He made the world. He made everything that is in the world. And not only did he make the world and everything that is in the world, he is not even served and worshiped by things made by man or by hands, as if we could ever do. Any time you've ever go and you think you just did God a solid, no, you didn't. He didn't need you. He chose to use you. It's kind of like when your kids help you do minor chores. You know what I'm saying? I still remember a lot of times my kids when they were really little, they're better at this now. Okay, but when they were really little, you know, we're like folding the laundry. And they come and they go, oh, I'm going to help. I'm going, oh, no. You know what I mean? Because you're about to fold the laundry about 8 times now. You know, that's like us trying to, like, say, God, look what I'm going to do for you. But God delights in using us. And I wouldn't trade a moment of my kids sitting there helping me fold the laundry 8 times. You know, that's the way our God sees it. He is our creator, and we are made in his image. That carries a very big tag here. That means that we are forever linked to his purpose and his will. That's what that means. He made us as our creator. He is our designer. He's our designer. He designed you. He designed everything about you. He designed your strengths. He designed your struggles. It's not that he did it per se, but he allows that struggle. We still live in a fallen world, and sometimes we still deal with the effects of that. But through that struggle, he strengthens you. He designs it all. In that design, he assigned you. Listen to what he says here. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. He assigned you. The family you're in, God put you in that family. The limitations you have, the strengths you have, where you live. It's kind of neat. I was born in the South, but nobody believes that. Even when I lived in the South, nobody believed that. I was born there, but God moved me here. Why? Because he was preparing me for that my whole life. God's preparing you for something your whole life. He has assigned you to this place. And I love how we're all made from one man, Adam. Even scientists recently caught up with that one a few years back. They even named it Y chromosome Adam. We all came from one man and one woman. Cool. I know the guy's name. I know his wife's name. I'm related. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about here. But he made from one man and made all the nations out of one blood. Guys, you realize we're together in this thing, created by our God, and he signed you. As your designer, he autographed you. His image is on you, broken by the fall, but still there. And sometimes we look and we see a broken reflection of who God is, but he has designed us. He has put us where we need to be, and he also defines all things. Look what it says here. Yet he is, it says in verse 27, he put us in these boundaries. He assigned us here that we should seek him, that we should seek him. That we should know him. We have that God-shaped void in our heart that we cry out for God. And it says, yet he's actually not far from each of us in verse 27. Verse 28 says, for in him we live and move and have our being. Do you realize when you breathe, you are testifying to the existence of God and that he has made you? Why? Because he first breathed into your lungs and you became a living flesh. A living soul, rather. That's the idea. He's breathed into us. Whenever we move, we are a glory to him. Whenever we walk, we're a glory to him. Some of us misuse that quite often. But the idea is in him we move. In him we breathe. His goodness extends to us all. Guys, do you realize, we went to, you know this, we left the state a little bit ago, and I've gotten up to that stage in life where I can leave my kids in another state. They're old enough. One's an adult now, so I can leave them in another state, fine, but I also make weird sounds every time I stand up. I'm kind of in that stage of life. And I know it's hard to believe, but even here, as I move, I'm becoming more and more grateful to God for that ability. Because we understand that all things come from him. We don't offer him, he gives to us. That's how this is working, all these things. And even says down here, and I love this part, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are all indeed his offspring. He's even pointing to their philosophers and their poets who have said things like, man, we're all children of a creator. And he goes, yeah, that's because we all cry out for the creator. He signed us. And that is why, if we don't understand God, he has created us, he's designed us, and he has signed us, his imprint on us. That is why if we do not seek him and understand him, you will seek something, because you are created to worship, and you will reach for an idol. You will reach for something to fill you. You'll go back to that spirit or that self or that stuff or that, that's where you're going to start reaching for. That's why Paul begins right here. He's wrecking their idea. Because life gets tough, what do? Reach for another idol. Whenever things happen here, they reach for this. Whenever this is what worked for me, and this is where I feel the best, therefore you better, blah, blah, blah. That's what they got into in Athens. And Paul's proclaiming them the way out of this is you get to know your God first as your creator. Secondly, God is our creator, but God is distinct from his creation. God is distinct from his creation, okay? He created, he is not part of the creation in that way. There's a lot of things out there that say, well, God's in all the trees and all the little birdies that went by, oh, God is in the birds. No, the Bible teaches that God created all that. He existed before all that. He will exist after that. God is God. When he met Moses at the burning bush, God looks at him and Moses is like, well, who do I say sent me? And God simply says, I am that I am, or I am who I am, depending on your translation. God is eternal. Now, this gets into some great theology here. God is transcendent. Oh, that's a big word. What's that word mean? It means he's not connected to the thing. He's not in the trees. He's not a part of the creation in that way. Pantheism is not a thing. Shintoism is not a thing. It's not this thing where we look out and we simply go, oh, wow, I can feel God in the tree. No, he is distinct from that. Yet, not only is he transcendent, but he is also immanent, meaning he is close. He is near. Look to verse 29. It says, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and the imagination of man. We don't form God in any way. We can't even imagine God. What do I mean by that? Prove that you can't imagine God. Very simply, anybody ever heard of the doctrine of the Trinity? Doctrine of the Trinity. What is the doctrine of the Trinity? I mean, this is a thing where it says we could never imagine this. The Trinity simply, it's a Latin term. I think it was like maybe Tertullian, one of the early church fathers who first used the term. Some people say you don't find that word in the Bible. Of course you don't. It's a Latin word, and the Bible wasn't written in Latin originally. It was Greek, right? But it was a word used to capture what the Bible does teach, just to define the doctrine, because you know how we like to define things, right? It teaches that God, eternally one God, exists in three persons: God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit. Now, I could borrow from Nabil Qureshi, the guy who wrote Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. He gives a really kind of a good analogy, maybe as best you could, about what kind of a being am I. I'm a human being. Okay, last I checked anyways. All right, so I'm a human being, and I am a person. Everybody in this room, we are all human beings. But you're not me, and I'm not you. We are distinct persons. I am a one being with one person. God exists as one being in three persons: Father, Son, and Spirit. You say, Joey, that doesn't make any sense. Neither does decaffeinated coffee, but it exists. Okay? Where'd you get the idea that if something doesn't make any sense, it can't exist? Right? I mean, the idea here is God is greater than us. And it doesn't enter our imagination what he is. But here's what he did do. We can't imagine him. We can't create this God. But yet he revealed himself. And he has a name. Name carries the idea of identity. We can know him. Name carries the idea of character. And oh, he's got a character. He is all powerful. He is all knowing. He is ever present. He is all, he is love. He is holiness. He is wrath. He is justice. He is so much. That is his character. But a name also brings the idea of consistency. He's always going to be consistent. The Bible says God does not change. He lacks nothing in and of himself. In fact, the doctrine of the Trinity proves that he is a God of love. What do you mean, Joey? Jesus says, I love the Father and he loves me. The Spirit comes to reflect the love of the Father and the Son. You see, he exists in relationship. He loved before he ever created. He didn't need us as an object of his love, but he chooses to use us as an object of his love. And that, my friends, is the only way a God can be a God of love. He is self-sufficient in all things. God's greater than we can imagine. He is bigger than we can imagine. And what Paul's teaching me here is, man, you guys hadn't even scratched the surface of a God if all you're doing is looking at stuff in the world. Because if he is distinct from his creation, and he is our creator who has designed and signed us, then you know what that ultimately means? That means nothing in this world will ever satisfy you, because you're created to desire something that is eternal and distinct. And as long as we seek it here, you're never going to find it. You see why doctrine's important? If we don't understand these things about our God, we will turn to idolatry. And we will seek stuff here. We'll even make an idol out of our God, because we will only use him for what we want from him. Church, we can't be that way. We've got to understand that our God is our creator, and that God is distinct from his creation. And third, that God is the redeemer of his creation. God's the redeemer of his creation. What does that mean? Look down to verse 30. Okay? He says, the times of ignorance, what ignorance? Oh, y'all's idolatry here in Athens. That's the ignorance. God overlooked. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he's appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Anybody want to take a guess who that is? Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, the Godhead. We'll talk about him next week. But here's the idea. Oh man, it's going to be, okay, back to this. God has set a day. There's a judgment day. That day is coming. Guys, you realize that he is the almighty creator, and he is distinct, so he gets a very nice vantage point, and yes, he is grieved by what he sees in our world. He is grieved by the hurt. He is grieved by the pain. He is angered and grieved by the sin. And a lot of people get really uncomfortable with the idea that God gets angry. The Jewish idiom, because the word for anger and the word for heat and the word for nose all sound alike, and when the Bible talks about God's patience, especially in the Old Testament, it sounds a lot like the word nose, and he's long patient. So the Jewish idiom for God's patience was that he had a long nose. They talked about God's long nose. But here's the idea. You want a God who gets angry at sin. You want a God with a sense of justice. You want a God who is going to avenge the right, because a God who is not able to avenge and a God who will not judge cannot be a God of love. A lot of people have trouble reconciling those things. But the reality is, if I love someone, I will come hard against something that is against them. Right? This is the way we view our God. It says he will judge. The bad guys don't get away with this, guys. Sin will not win this war. But he will also redeem. Look what he's put it. He will judge us by what? I love this. Listen to this. He will judge the world in righteousness. He's not going to make any mistakes about it. By a man whom he's appointed. By a man whom he's appointed. Whom he also proved it by raising him from the dead. Here's the gospel. Jesus died to bear that judgment. The judgment that God had appointed. He bore the wrath that we deserve because he was sinless. He lived this life sinlessly. Why? Because he is God the Son. And he won the battle. And as he bore the wrath of God, that judgment of God upon a cross, bleeding out for our sin, and the judgment we deserved, his blood covered that sin, paying the debt, because the scripture says without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. Why? Because the wages of sin is death. Jesus died for us. He rose from the dead on the third day, showing that that sacrifice was accepted. And now we are given the righteousness of God by that sacrifice. And that is why God judges the world by Christ. You see, here's the thing. Our judgment now looms upon the decision we make regarding God the Son. Because God took it upon himself to redeem his creation that deserved his judgment. And now we stand in only one of two camps, judgment or redemption. And it is not based on how good we are, how pretty we are, and how great our jokes are, or how much of that decaf coffee we drink. It is based upon the decision you make with Jesus Christ. Do I trust the Creator who has provided my salvation by his eternal design? Do I trust it? Or am I still trying? Am I still trying? Because that is how he has chosen. He loves you immeasurably. Because we could talk all day about God's awesome power. We could. I've told you this story before. That I was standing outside, my parents locked me out one night. They say accidentally. As I'm outside just at their house in Mississippi, man, you can see like every star. You can see stars that aren't stars, right? You can see everything, which is kind of weird sometimes. But you can see everything up there. And I'm just marveling at this great creation of God. And as I'm marveling at this great creation of God, the thought that comes into my mind is, God, this infinite power that you have. You spoke this into creation on day 4. And then it was like, wait a minute though. All this awesome power, and what did you choose to do? Redeem us sinners. And it's such a work of his power. Because you guys realize the only way God could ever, people say, and we'll get into this later as we talk about sin in this Doctrine series, but people say, well, why doesn't God just do away with sin? Do you realize what you're saying? There's only one of two ways for him to do away with sin. Number one is to get rid of sinners. Number two is to get rid of sinners by redeeming them, transforming them, and making them righteous in his sight. It's the only way. And that's what he's chosen to do. So what do we do now? I mean, what do we do with this great God who's creator, who's distinct from his creation and therefore indefinable by it, and but yet he redeems? What do we do? Guys, here's what we do. We respond to his greatness. That's what we do. We simply respond to his greatness. And I want to wrap it up this morning by just giving you a couple ways to respond to God's greatness. Stuff you can leave here doing today. And this is going to find you where you are. This is the power of doctrine. It's been well said, in our darkest moments is when we need our doctrine most, because it gives us the anchor point to fall back on. First, trust in his sovereignty. Trust in his sovereignty. We talked about that word last week. It means that he's in control. Trust it, right? He doesn't change. You can trust him. I said this last week, but it's worth it again. He created you. He designed you. He's got the bird's eye view, and he is actively working to redeem you. What does that mean? In your life, let me take away your fear here. Okay, I'm serious. What I'm about to tell you will eliminate all fear in your life. You will never fear again. You ready for this? Understand that the worst thing you fear, you think about it right here. Worst thing you fear. Only one of two things can happen. Either it will happen to you, or it will not happen to you. Roll that one around for a second. It either will happen or it won't happen. And either way, God will use his power to work through it. Either way. He will glorify himself through you either way. Sometimes you're the windshield. Sometimes you're the bug. Right? It's just the reality. But either way, God is going to work his sovereignty through that, because either way, windshield, bug, whatever, you are under the crafting hand of a creator who is molding you to reflect his redemption. Trust his sovereignty. Secondly, let his goodness be your standard. Let his goodness be your standard. I mean, think about this. If you had God's standards, what would change in your life? If you looked at something and said, man, that's awesome, but it ain't as good as God. Man, that does make me feel good, and it does make me feel important. It does make me feel blah, blah, but it's not as good as God. What if we had God's standards this way? How would that change our pursuits? Make your standard God. Make your standard God. It's kind of like after you've had the filet mignon, the chicken McNugget is no longer valid. Learn to look at God as that and see his awesomeness and be like, you know what? God is better. What if I don't believe God is better? You know what? I get that. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, you're hungry. That chicken McNugget looks pretty nice, right? But if you were on your way to Bobby Flay's house, would you stop at McDonald's for a quick pick-me-up before you got there? Man, you'd be fasting for like 6 days. Okay, you'd be like almost dead because you want to taste every morsel of what he just made, right? You guys know who Bobby Flay is? Okay, yeah. You got to beat him on TV or something. I think the show's rigged. But anyways, we've got to learn to think of God in those terms. And I can promise you from experience, yes, I mean, I'm not infallible, guys. You realize that. Get to know me if you haven't realized that yet. But when you are tempted to reach for something that is not God, sometimes you have to make a willful choice and a sacrificial choice to go, you know what? I know God is better. I don't feel it right now, but I know he is. And turn away and embrace, and then you will find that truth. You'll find that he is better. Let his goodness be your standard. And lastly, pursue him with all you got. Pursue him with every bit of your life. Stop chasing what is not life. That idolatry we talked about, the idolatry of the spiritual, the idolatry of the stuff, the idolatry of the self, the idolatry of the spin, the idolatry of the spectacle. None of that is life. Stop wasting your time on it. Let's jump back and grab our God and pursue him and him alone. What about pursuing him? We always talk about pursue God. How do I pursue God? Well, realize you're responsible to him. Seek him for his will and purpose. Seek him for transformation in your life. And honor what he tells you to do. Trust him to empower you. And go do what he says. What's the power of that, Joey? Why do I need to know who God is and surrender my life to him? General William Booth, you know who that is? He founded the Salvation Army. You know those guys who ring the bell at Christmas time? You know that guy, right? You Google him, you'll know who he is. But anyways, he's sitting here doing this. They do a whole lot more than that, okay? But it's just that's the way most of us know him. That's how we get our that guy thing. But a Presbyterian minister was once interviewing him. And in the course of the interview, he looks at him and he says, "What's the secret to your success?" And Booth answered this way. He said, "There are a lot of people smarter than me. There are people with more opportunities and more resources. But William Booth surrendered to God. And everything great that the Salvation Army has ever done is because of our surrender to God." And so the minister wrote this down. He left saying, "The secret then is, the greatness of a man's power is the measure of his surrender." Church, we will worship something. You will surrender your life to something. Make sure it's God, and not a God of your own making. A God who has revealed himself, who he is to be, because that is who God is.